Ladies and gentlemen, what a delight it is to be here. And what a delight to listen to that marvellous introduction. And after it, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. But I'm going to begin, as Nigel Farage would surely do, by taking a drink. Your very good health.
Cheers.
St. George, he was for England. And before he slew the dragon, he drank a pint of English ale out of an English flagon. Now, what an extraordinary period we are living through. What did the governing class, the classe politique, as the French with proper contemptuousness call it, not understand about 17.4 million votes, the largest number of votes ever recorded in any election, referendum or other plebiscite conducted in these islands over the last 1,000 years? What do they not understand about a majority of 1.75 million to break us free from the sclerotic European tyranny by Clark and to become once again a proud and independent nation? The moment that result came in, from that moment on, relentlessly, 9/10 of the entire central civil service of this country, 3/4 of the elected parliament of this country, most of the unions, most of the big businesses, most of the churches have worked flat out to overturn the people's will. Do we, the people, accept their misconduct? No. I did not hear any answer. No. I still don't hear any answer. No. Now we're getting somewhere. Just imagine what would have happened if the present Parliament of eunuchs and vagabonds in Westminster had been asked to get together and produce a more modern version of Hamlet's great soliloquy. This is how these nincompoops would have written it. To be, or the contrary. Whether the former or the latter be preferable, Mr. Speaker, would seem to admit of some difference of opinion, the answer in the present case being of an affirmative or of a negative character, according to whether one elects on the one hand mentally to endure the disfavour of fortune, or on the other boldly to envisage adverse conditions in the prospect of eventually bringing them to a conclusion. The condition of sleep is similar to, if not identical to, that of death. And with the addition of finality, the former might be regarded as identical with the latter, so that in this regard it might be argued with regard to sleep that could the addition be effected, an end would be put to a multiplicity of inconveniences, not to mention a number of downright evils incidental to our fallen nature, Mr. Speaker, and thus a consummation achieved of a most gratifying nature. What we are dealing with is people who will not speak the Queen's English. They will not make plain what they really think. It is all shadows and shadow boxing. And nobody will stand up and speak for the people except the United Kingdom Independence Party. The only party which does what it says on the tin. The Liberal Party are illiberal, they're not democratic. The Labour Party have nothing to do with Labour anymore. The Conservative Party have long since abandoned conservatism. But the one thing you can say for the United Kingdom Independence Party is that it is the party that stands for the United Kingdom's independence. And how then do we deal with current events, and I want to begin. I'm going to set out a programme which I hope that you and everyone in UKIP and everyone who cares about our country will join in and take part in. And the first stage, as I promised to your chairman earlier this evening, starts right here in Liverpool. One of the things that has happened with the many realignments now going on in politics is that we who are Catholic and we who are Unionist are increasingly finding common cause. I like this because I've always been a Catholic since I was 3 weeks old and joined by baptism. And I've always been a Unionist since birth because I had parents who educated me properly in the value of keeping the United Kingdom united. And therefore, though I was a Catholic and though in places like Liverpool and Glasgow there had in the past been divisions between the Catholics on the one hand and the Protestants who were on the whole Unionists on the other, now we must stand together, Unionists and Catholics together, to defend the United Kingdom against the collection of ragbag Marxists and fellow travellers and socialists and so-called liberals. And I know that many of you, like me, are Catholic. Some of you, unlike me, may be Protestant. Of course, the road to Rome is always open, and take your time. But the point is that we are united in our loyalty to Almighty God, to our families, to the Crown, and to our nation in all 4 of its great pillars. Not only England and Wales and Scotland, but also Northern Ireland. All of these 4 pillars of the Union stand together. Without any one of those pillars, the Union will fall. So we must stand with the Democratic Unionist Party at this difficult juncture. The Conservative Party, to its shame, is not fully standing by its agreement to stand by the Democratic Unionist Party. Mrs. May's deal threatens the unity of the United Kingdom, and rightly the DUP are refusing to countenance it or with their votes in Parliament support it. And I am proud of that admittedly small minority of Brexiteers in the Conservative Party who are standing by the Democratic Unionist Party, and that, I would suggest, whatever our past political alignments may have been here in Liverpool, that, I suggest, is now our duty too. So our first message then is to the Democratic Unionist Party. It is a message of goodwill from UKIP, not only here in Liverpool, but more widely. We stand with you in your concern about Mrs. May's deal, and we will do our best to make sure that nothing is done that in any way threatens the integrity of our United Kingdom. Yeah. Now, my second point is this. We in UKIP had in Nigel Farage perhaps the most outstanding politician in Britain since Margaret Thatcher. And I think we should all begin here by making it very clear, by the very loud noises we make, and extra chairs have had to be called for, incidentally. This is a very well-attended meeting. I want to hear a very loud round of enthusiastic applause for everything that Nigel Farage has done in getting us the referendum and getting us at least the chance to break away and become independent once again. It was my honour and privilege for some years to serve under Nigel as his leader in Scotland, and he did a most wonderful job. He came whenever I asked. He would always say, "Do I have to come? I don't like Scotland and the Scots don't like me." I said, "They do really. It's just that when they throw things at you," this is a term of affection in Scotland. And so he would always come with us, and he was very, very good. And in fact, because he came and because he was seen around Scotland and wasn't frightened to come, even though they did threaten violence and make trouble for him, we managed to get our man in and elected as the European MP for Scotland, the first time any UKIP candidate had been elected to any national or international office by the electors. And that, again, was an outstanding result, and Nigel was very important in that. But here in Liverpool, bringing it back to Liverpool, Nigel also had a deputy, and that is Paul Nuttall. And Paul also was and is outstanding, a most remarkable supporter of the party and of his leader, who they were very old friends. And I want to pay tribute to Paul as well. He too was of great assistance to me. The only time when we really disagreed was when I said to him, after that extraordinary victory, when UKIP got 24% of the vote in the last European elections, I said to him, do you realise, Paul, what this means? We were sitting in a pub in central Liverpool. I said, do you realise what this means? It means that under the House of Lords Act 1999, UKIP is now entitled to nominate to the House of Lords Commission 26 UKIP peers. Now, I'm not the leader of the party nationally. I can't do this. You have to make sure that the party nationally does this. Because if we can get 26 UKIP peers into the House, no question of electing them, all we have to do is nominate them, and the Commission more or less has to appoint them. Then, if and when we get a referendum, if and when they try to make difficulties over Brexit, we'll have 26 peers in there to speak up for why the British people should get what the British people voted for. And he was such a busy man, unfortunately, it never got done. And that was a disappointment because we need every man jack in the House of Commons and the House of Lords at the moment so that people speak for Britain. But the reason I mention Nigel and also Paul Nuttall is that both of them have left the UK Independence Party. And they have left over a very unfortunate issue in which we were tempted, the leadership were tempted, not me personally, but they were tempted to get too close to an avowedly racialistic party, the British National Party. Not everyone in the British National Party is racialist. I accept that. That point was made earlier this evening. However, one thing that Nigel was always very sensible about was understanding that if we wish to make any sort of impact, we must not do or be seen to do anything which makes us obviously look extremist. Because I've met all of you here this evening, talked to you, there isn't a single extremist in the room. You are all sensible, working people, down to earth, from Liverpool. One of the joys of coming to the north is to meet people like you. I was brought up in Yorkshire. I just love it to bits up here. And none of you are extremists. UKIP isn't an extremist party. But unfortunately, through a series of perhaps not very wise decisions at the centre, UKIP has made itself look like an extremist party for the first time. Nigel was very good at slapping down anything like that. Since he went, we haven't been so good at slapping it down. And the problem with that is that just at the very moment when it may well be, and I'll come on to this a bit later on, that we have to fight the next lot of European elections because they mess around so we don't leave Europe on April the 12th or May the 22nd or whatever date they think up next. We won't be ready because we're divided. We've got the Brexit party and we've got the UKIP party. We both believe exactly the same things, and we are divided simply because UKIP has allowed itself too readily, and I'm afraid with a little justification, to be made out to be extremist when we simply are not. So what we have to do, and this is an absolute essential, and we have to do it within weeks, UKIP nationally has to mend its fences with Nigel and Paul and all of us who are not extremists, who are moderates, as all of you are. We are going to have to stand shoulder to shoulder together to face those who would destroy our country and keep it imprisoned in the unelected, irreformably anti-democratic European Union. Do I have your vociferous agreement that this rapprochement between those of the former leadership who were moderate and sensible and the present leadership must now be achieved as an urgent matter of policy?
Yes.
I did not hear a yes.
Yes.
I did not hear a yes.
Yes.
Come along, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
That's better. This video is being put up on YouTube, and I want each of you to put it up on your own sites as well. If you have your own YouTube channel, add this video to it. The fact that it's on somewhere else doesn't matter. The more often it appears all over YouTube, the better. And I'm going to ask your officers here to make sure that UKIP headquarters gets a copy, and I will try to make sure that Nigel gets a copy, and I'm sure somebody here will make sure that Paul gets a copy. And that way, they will realise that we cannot afford internal divisions at this vital moment. We must all stand together, and we must accept that in Nigel we have had, and I think will need once again, the most exceptional and outstanding of leaders. So that's my second point. I now turn to the third and main subject that I want to talk about tonight, which is the extraordinary situation in Westminster at the moment. Brexit. Here we are with a Prime Minister in name only, arguing for Brexit in name only, with the very thick skin of a pachydermatous unicorn. We have, you've worked it out, some of you are ahead of me already on this, we have a Prino pursuing Brino like a rhino. Now, the fact is, and I'm going to give you a lot of background here, and some of it's a little detailed, but you need to know this. The fact is that at every stage, not only 90% of the civil service, not only 75% of Parliament, but practically the entire government has been working overtime to make sure we don't get Brexit, to make sure that Brexit doesn't mean Brexit, that leave doesn't mean leave, and that we remain shackled in as many possible ways as they can think up to the commissars of the European tyranny by Clark, whom nobody elects. I was talking on the train on the way up here to a young lad who had his first vote had been in that referendum. I said, "You're a young man, you voted to stay in the European Union, didn't you?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Right, I'm going to tell you how a law is made in the European Union." I said, "Stage one is to propose the law." I said, "Did you know that the European Parliament that we elect cannot bring forward a bill?" He said, "What?" I said, "No, it can't. It has no power to bring forward a bill. Only the unelected commissars decide what is put before, and therefore what is not put before the European Parliament, what becomes law and what doesn't become law." And I said to him, "Did you know that if the European Parliament makes a decision that the unelected commissars doesn't like, who prevails? The unelected commissars prevail because they have the right at will under the Maastricht Treaty, it's mentioned 5 times in separate places, so they really meant it, to override any decision of the elected European Parliament. Did you know that?" He said, "No." And I said, "That is how serious this is. You, as a young lad, believe in Europe, so do I. And it is because I am pro-European that I am anti the European Union. Because this was the continent that gave to the world not only the concept, but the name and the reality of democracy. And yet, the European Union is anti-democratic. The will of the people does not prevail. Just look at Brexit. They are determined to keep us in and get our money and carry on lording it over us. And they are terrified that if we break free and begin making trade deals all over the world, Britain will once again become what she was before, the foremost trading nation on the planet. And that businesses which have already been relocating to the United Kingdom from all over the world because they want to be here when we get Brexit, will do so much business here that Europe will pale into insignificance by comparison. There's another reason why we have to break free straight away. At the moment, and this is private information which I'm going to share with you publicly, the two major commercial banks in Germany, which of course is the economic centre of the EU, are the Deutsche Bank and the Commerzbank. Between them, they are at the moment holding 1,000 trillion euros of useless paper because they are trying artificially to back up the collapsing euro. If we can leave kind of in the next few weeks, we may leave before this collapse happens. If we do leave before this collapse happens, we are to some extent, not perfectly, but to some extent, removed from the risk that we too will collapse. So this is quite an important moment for us to break free. But let me talk a bit about how it is that Mrs. May has worked and worked assiduously to prevent Brexit from happening while pretending to foster it. I'm going to give you the evidence, and then I'm going to show the one rather large chink in her armour, which we are preparing to exploit, so that we get Brexit, whether she likes it or not.
Yes.
The will of the people will prevail here. Now, the first thing that made me realise that she was just as dishonest as she had been when I was at Cambridge and she was at Oxford, and she was ambitious but useless then, and she's ambitious but useless now. And I remember she was Theresa Brazier then, and she was an arrogant little puss, and she still is. So, this is what she did. You'll remember there was a rather strange court case. You know, what should have happened is we had the referendum, the result was plain, so we write a letter, dear Mr. whoever it is in the EU, we are going to say bye-bye under Article 50. Terribly sorry, but you have not convinced the people of Britain that you're worth paying all these tens of billions, 350 million a week, which we could be spending on our NHS. You see. And, oh, see how they tried to present that as though it were a lie. It is true, we were and still are spending 350 million a week on paying the EU, just to be the EU. And if we don't have to pay that to the EU, if we choose to spend it on the NHS, that is what we shall, for the first time, have the freedom to do. So let us be very clear that the words on that bus were not, repeat, not, repeat, lot, not a lie. They were the strict truth. And the reason why the other side called them a lie is that they were acutely embarrassed at just how much money we were paying to the smelly socks of Brussels. So, the first sign that Mrs. May was her usual self and that we were not going to get Brexit was that a strange court case came about by somebody called Gina Miller, some city slicker woman. And this Gina Miller case said, ooh, Mrs. May, you can't just write to the EU and say that we're leaving, because if you do that, that triggers the Article 50 process, and in 2 years we actually have to leave, and that would cause huge changes to legislation, and you can't exercise the royal prerogative by making agreements with foreign powers in such a manner as to alter existing UK legislation unless you have the prior consent of Parliament. Now, that was what Gina Miller argued. And the reason why I know that Theresa May and the government were playing dirty on Brexit was that there is one very obvious argument against that case I've just outlined, Gina Miller's case, which is that this was an exercise of the royal prerogative and therefore it can't be used to change legislation. What is that argument? Does anybody happen to know? Well, anyone who has ever studied constitutional law will know what the royal prerogative is. The prerogativa regalis, going right back to Norman French, or Norman Latin in that case, is a discretionary power. It is a power which the Queen, because she is the Queen, she's at the top of the heap, can exercise on her own. And the government, now that we have a constitutional monarchy, has the right to exercise the prerogativa regalis instead of the Queen. But it is a discretionary power. The government can decide whether or not to use that power. And that was what the whole argument was about. You can't use that discretionary power in a way that would change legislation without Parliament's permission. But Article 50 says that any nation that has decided under its own constitutional arrangements to leave the EU must notify the EU in writing at once. That's what it says. And what this means is that Theresa May's letter was not an exercise of the royal prerogative. It was not the exercise of a discretionary power. It was the necessary fulfillment of a treaty obligation, and in those circumstances, because international treaty law prevails over the domestic law of the United Kingdom, it was not merely her right to send that letter at once, it was her bounden duty under the terms of the Lisbon Treaty. But she didn't want to send that letter straight away, because then there was only 2 years between the time she sent the letter and the time we left, and the mandate from the British people to leave the EU would be too fresh by the end of that 2 years. We'd still be raring to get out. So they wanted to build in approximately another year's delay so that they could then get the BBC saying, well, of course, people's minds have changed now. It's been 3 years, not 2, since all this happened. And this is exactly what you now see happening. Now, I have read all the pleadings at every stage in that Gina Miller case. At no point, and this is the remarkable thing, this is the revealing thing, at no point during that case did Her Majesty's government or any of the law officers or those acting on their behalf in court ever point out to the court that the exercise of the obligation to write that Article 50 letter was not an exercise of the royal prerogative. It was a prerogative as a discretionary power, and the sending of the Article 50 letter was a treaty obligation binding upon Her Majesty's government regardless. That point was never argued. Why not? Because if anyone had stood up in that court and said, hang on a moment, Supreme Court, whoever you are, you can't intervene here. This is a treaty obligation which we as a government must fulfill. The court would have had to say, yep, it's a fair cop. There's nothing we can do to intervene. You go ahead and send the letter. The whole thing could have been over at first instance straight away, but it didn't happen. The government never argued that point. Now we come on to a second curious case. And you'll see where this is going very shortly. The second curious case was one which you may not even have seen reported. It was done so quietly. And this time the government got into league with not with some city slicker woman, but with, of all people, the Scottish National Party, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Scotland. They got together with them. And the National Socialist Workers' Party of Scotland put up a case to the European so-called court of so-called justice. And they said, what we'd like to do is to clarify that if the UK government decides, this is a very important point, decides to withdraw its application to leave the EU under Article 50, can it do that on its own without the permission of all the other member states? Now, Article 50 is actually quite clear. If, once you've sent the letter, you want to unsend it or change its terms or delay or do anything like that, you have to have the unanimous consent of all the member states before you can do it. But it was all arranged that this went to the European so-called Court of So-called Justice, which is intégriste to its fingertips. It was always going to say, yes, of course, if you wish, you can ignore the actual terms of Article 50 because the integration of the European Union comes first. They pretty much said this in their judgment, and therefore we don't have to worry about what the treaty actually says. Of course, if you want to withdraw your application to leave, you can do so. And unfortunately, the law, as it is found by the European Court of so-called Justice, is the supreme law of the United Kingdom. It tops any of our courts, and there's nothing we can do about that. It's all done behind our backs by the SNP talking to the court, and the government, yet again, did not produce the obvious argument against it, which is that Article 50 expressly forbids any such thing. So twice, the government failed to provide the central, obvious argument that would have won it the case and we could have got our Brexit by now. So now you see a pattern emerging. And now you're going to see the point of my telling you all this rather obscure legal stuff. And the point is this, that just a few days ago, Theresa May went behind the back of Parliament and said to the EU, please can we have an extension of the Article 50 terms, because the wording of Article 50 is so clear on that. They weren't allowed to extend the period of Article 50 without the unanimous consent of all the other member states. They had to go and get that. However, when they went to get that, they were exercising the royal prerogative. They were not exercising a treaty obligation. There's nothing in the treaties that said you must go and ask for an extension. The government decided for its own reasons that it wished to do so. That was an exercise of the royal prerogative. And did the government, following the judgment in the Gina Miller case, go to Parliament and say, ooh, you passed a law in July of 2018 called the European Union brackets Withdrawal brackets Act, in which at section 20, subsection 1, it says that the exit day shall be 11 o'clock in the evening on the 29th of March 2019, which, as I record this, is tomorrow, about 24 hours from now. And did she go to Parliament and say, I want an extension, please will you allow me to have that extension by amending the Act so that I can go and have these negotiations with a foreign power and exercise the royal prerogative? No, she did not. She went illegally to Brussels, negotiated with an alien entity, and said, behind the back of Parliament, we want to extend Article 50, when Parliament had already said that the exit day was the 29th of March 2019. Now, you may have heard people talk of the government having indulged in a betrayal. Let me tell you what it really is. This is a betrayal of the people's will by the governing class, pretty much the entire governing class. It is what the French call a trahison d'éclair. Now that word trahison by the clerc, the governing class, is where we get our word treason from. It is a Norman French word. We are not, in the formal sense, talking of a mere betrayal here. We are talking of high treason. Mrs. May went to negotiate with a foreign power behind the back of Parliament without having got Parliament's consent to vary the terms of an Act of Parliament which prevented her from reaching the agreement that she reached. Now, what can we do about this? Parliament only on Wednesday passed retrospectively a cover for Mrs. May by saying, OK, we can have either April the 12th or or May the 22nd as the date of leaving, depending on whether her deal is voted for tomorrow or not. You may know tomorrow they're going to have a third go at getting this instrument of capitulation that she has spent 2 years crafting with the EU through the Commons. And I think they still probably won't. It's not quite as clear as it was, but I think they'll still find it difficult to get it through. So the game plan is that if they get it through, we are imprisoned in Europe forever under the terms of the withdrawal agreement. If they don't get it through, at that point, they will do one of two things. They will either try to go back to Europe to get a further extension, again, without having gone to Parliament first, or they will try simply unilaterally to withdraw from the whole thing, again, without having gone to Parliament first. Now, if they do either of those two things, this is what the law says. If you treat with a foreign power in a manner which goes behind the back of Parliament and explicitly repudiates an act of the British Parliament without first having obtained the consent of Parliament, that is, by definition, sir, you are a lawyer, what is it?
What's that? My wife was just calling.
And thus was Britain lost.
Treason.
High treason. That's what it is. The very definition of high treason is if you treat with a foreign power, and the EU for this purpose, though we belong to it still, is a foreign power, and you go behind Parliament's back and you make negotiated agreements which would change UK legislation, which specifically prevent you from doing exactly what you are doing, that is high treason. It cannot be retrospectively rectified by Parliament, as they have attempted to do so far. So what can we do about this? You must have felt as helpless as I have felt, given that we didn't have our 26 peers in the House of Lords, which we would have had if I'd had my way. We don't have a voice in the House of Commons. We have one or two voices in the Lords who were there before, but never has a UKIP peer been appointed. And when I've stood as a UKIP peer, I've always got nul point from my fellow hereditary peers because they're all kind of, Liberal Democrats and Labour and Conservative. There aren't any UKIP ones, except for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I am precious and valuable to you all. Now, what then shall we do about this? There is a very useful procedure in UK law which emerged from the courts of equity in the 14th century. And the courts of equity were designed to try to even up the balance between the ordinary people and the might of the state. And the courts of equity are no more, but emerging from them came the doctrine of what is known as judicial review of administrative action. Now, Mrs. May is now in the interesting position of having, in the formal sense and beyond all doubt, committed high treason. The penalty for high treason continues to be death. Now, I am not at this stage calling for Mrs. May's execution, because I am a Christian, and we do have to love her very dearly, even if we wish she was not shafting the British nation in the way that she is. What we can, however, do, and this is why it was most important that our lawyers here should listen very carefully to this, what we can do is write to her in terms of the pre-action protocol in judicial review, a letter before action in judicial review, warning her that if ever again she tries to go to negotiate with the European Union in a manner that would change UK law, which expressly forbids her to negotiate that particular aspect, without having first sought and obtained Parliament's consent to vary the UK EU Withdrawal Act, then not only will we apply to the courts for judicial review of her action in thus disobeying the law, but we will also report her for high treason. Now, ladies and gentlemen, do you think that what I have just outlined is too extreme.
No.
Look at what has happened here. I'll tell you why it isn't extreme. This proud nation wishes to leave the European Union with regret, not because we are a proud nation, but because we are a democratic nation. Since Magna Carta and through the Glorious Revolution and all the way to the enfranchisement even of women, which some of us might or might not regret, but let us accept, there are some ladies here, I mustn't say anything like that. I'm only teasing. Of course, we're delighted that you should have the vote. It's actually much more sensible if you do. Frankly, one almost might go the other way and say only women should have the vote. But the point is, we have had an inexorable progress for 1,000 years from absolute tyranny to absolute democracy. Perhaps the purest form of democracy the world has ever seen, until that fateful day when Edward Heath pushed us into the dismal tyranny by Clark that is the European Union. And suddenly our democracy went. Had we shared our democracy with the rest of Europe by making the commissars be elected, just like ministers here, by making them directly accountable to the voters of all the member states, I think all of us here would have cheerfully been willing to share our radical concept of real popular democracy and direct government of our governing class by us through the ballot box with the rest of Europe. And with my noble friend, Lord Stockton, I worked very hard during the days of the European Constitutional Convention, some 20 years ago now, to try to get the commissars elected, to try to take away from them and from the bureaucracy the power to make law directly without reference to Parliament or to override the European Parliament, and to make the constitution of our European Union, of our continent, a continent of which we are proud, a properly democratic and accountable constitution. And I shall tell you why we failed. We failed because, as I told you earlier, the only people who were allowed to decide what went into the constitutional draft and what did not were the unelected commissars whose powers we were wishing and proposing to take away and transfer to the people who would then elect them. And they said, no, we do not wish to give up our power. And it was at that moment that Alexander and I realized that it was simply no longer possible to do what we had done originally and vote for and support the European Union. It had become a monster, an anti-democratic monster. It was essentially the Soviet constitution moved westward. It was not, in any useful or recognizable or legitimate sense, democratic. And that alone is the reason why this country wishes to depart. We have tried and tried and tried again to reform the Constitution of Europe encapsulated in these turgid treaties in such a way as to restore to the continent that invented it the concept and the reality of democracy in its highest governance. And we have failed not through any defect, weakness, idleness or incompetence on our part, but solely on the sullen refusal of those whose power we wished once again to transfer to the elected hands of the people to part with that power. They wished to hang on to their tyranny by Clark. They wished to hang on to their miserable oligarchy. They wished to continue to rule us with a rod of iron, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is not the way we, the people of Britain, are made. And if the appalling Mr. Tusk or Mr. Barnier or the other dreadful characters on the European stage strutting and fretting their hour upon the stage, and then they'll be heard no more. Let me say to them, we have no quarrel with the continent of Europe, the Europe of the great civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome that I studied for 3 years at Cambridge and have studied ever since with admiration. We have no quarrel with the Europe that has brought so much inventiveness, so much art, so much music, so much sculpture, so much architecture, so much splendor to the whole world. We are proud to be Europeans. And if you have never heard that ever before at a UKIP meeting, well, you jolly well should have, because that is what we are. We are not xenophobes. Most of us here, whether we're Catholics or Protestants, we are Christians. And the sole commandment of Christians is, thou shalt love. And that is precisely why we in UKIP, and particularly here in Liverpool, are so easy and so comfortable with democracy itself. Because what is democracy but a sharing with the neighbours whom we love of the decisions that govern our country? The exercise of democracy in Britain is a mutual exercise of love by the people of Britain, and our dearest wish was that this exercise of love through the ballot box should have been extended from how we do it here to the rest of Europe. But the commissars would not allow it. So now you see why it is that we have been plotted against by our own elected government. I've explained the mechanisms by which that plot has been carried out, and I have explained the one vulnerability that they have, which is that Theresa May has already committed high treason and is about to do so again. And if given a proper warning in the due legal form, she will have to go back to our elected parliament and ask permission before she goes to Europe and changes the date yet again. And they had to lie to Parliament yesterday to get that retrospective approval for what she did. They had to say that the date could only be changed after it had been negotiated international law. That was entirely untrue, and they were called out on that by the constitutionalists on the Conservative benches. So they've lied to the House, they've lied to the country, they've deliberately turned their backs on that vote, they've played it long in the hope that that will allow the BBC and the other haters of democracy to say, right, the mandate is gone, it's all too long away, we must have another referendum. But we will win our democracy back. We will not allow this Christmas game to continue. If Mrs. May steps out of line again, there will be a letter on their desk, not only from me, but I hope from all of you, which will say, thus far and no further. You are going to give us our country back, and if you do not, you are going to jail for a very, very, very long time. Thank you.